Leading the charge with unrestrained fury, Gislin's eyes showed no mercy. The hatred he carried for Desmond County and the duchy drove him to bulldoze anything and anyone who dared to threaten what was his. Disguised as Dygald recruits and mercenaries, the sheer size of the force made it unmistakable that it was outside Lord, helping in the war dispute between Perdium and Dygald. Shrouded in the darkness of the night sky, no one in the camp realized an ambush was closing in until the opposing force was at their doorstep and Gislin's force emerged from the shadows. With a savage grin, Kair tore through the battlefield. With each swing of his sword, he struck down a soldier stationed at the supply unit of Dygald's force. To the left, Gillian wielded a long-handled battle axe. Every swing felled a few soldiers in his path, cleaving through their ranks without hesitation. His axe, cutting through the chaos of battle, sent soldiers flying in all directions. Mana surged through Gislin's body, propelling him to sever the necks of every soldier in his path. His blade, empowered by the mana, cut through the soldiers effortlessly. He pushed through the fear, the uncertainty, and charged forward with all his might. Nearby, Belinda charged ready to cover his back. Though worried about her young lord's first battle against human opponents, she did not voice her concerns, staying vigilant as she prepared to protect him from any potential threats. The Dygald soldiers were in disarray. Unprepared for an ambush, they had underestimated the tactical capabilities of Perdium's forces. They thought that dividing their troops would be impossible, never considering such a well-coordinated attack. However, Gislin and Gillian made quick work of them. They were no ordinary warriors. Gislin, drawing from the experience of his past life, led his mercenaries with the precision of a high-level knight, and Gillian's battle-hardened skills only added to the might of the force. The soldiers on the outskirts were wiped out in an instant. Gislin quickly reached the opposite end of the camp, spun his horse around, and issued orders to move according to plan. He instructed that not a single soldier of Dygald's would survive the night. Torches, struck by flying bodies, were scattered about, igniting nearby tents. Soon, flames began to spread across the camp. Chaos erupted as soldiers ran about in confusion. One of the high-ranking officials in Dygald's unit rushed toward his superior. The soldier breathlessly informed Baron Fabreau that they had been ambushed, urging him to take immediate action. Fabreau swiftly exited his tent, frustration boiling over as he took in the sight of his camp in chaos. He bellowed at the soldiers nearby, demanding to know where the guards had been. Panic surged in his mind, and Fabreau shouted orders for his forces to regroup. He insisted that they still outnumbered the enemy, urging them to form ranks and stop the attack. Despite his efforts to calm himself, the reality of the situation was beginning to set in. The soldier returned with grim news that over 70% of their forces had already been wiped out. The man, the myth, the legend, Gordon the Muscle followed closely behind Gislin. Hardened from battles in the Forest of Beasts, the mercenary's charge was unstoppable. His immense strength and brutal efficiency tore through the enemy soldiers with terrifying speed. Gillian, noticing the need to conserve stamina, switched to a smaller weapon, sacrificing some of his destructive power but enabling him to move faster and continue his assault. Meanwhile, Kair remained fierce, striking soldiers with precision, cutting through their ranks with reckless abandon. Gislin stayed resolute, his eyes gleaming with killing intent. His blade, sharpened with mana, sliced through the soldiers with practiced ease, each strike landing with deadly accuracy. Though his strength was a fraction of what he had in his previous life, Gislin was, in this skirmish, the harbinger of death. His mercenaries followed his every move. Noticing Gislin charging at the front lines, Fabreau recognized him as an entirely different presence. His face drenched in sweat, Fabreau finally realized that his 1,000 soldiers had no chance against such a force. In a panic, Fabreau turned abruptly, ordering a retreat. His aide looked confused, but Fabreau was certain that if the battle continued, he would lose his head, not just his land. In that instant, his aide was struck in the neck with uncanny precision. Shock flashed across Fabreau's face as he watched in silent attack. The speed and accuracy of the attack left him paralyzed with fear. Though Fabreau himself was unharmed, he collapsed to the ground, following the sound of his aide's lifeless body hitting the earth. It was Belinda who had reached them. Sitting atop her horse, she coldly addressed him, her voice carrying a chilling calmness. She remarked on the unlikely meeting, calling him the vassal of Perdium. Fear surged through Fabro's mind. His 1,000 soldiers had been obliterated, and he had relied too heavily on their sheer numbers, missing his opportunity to escape. His camp was burning, and the corpses of soldiers and knights lay scattered across the battlefield. In an effort to wage war against Perdium, Dygald's entire supply unit had been wiped out, leaving only Fabro alive. Now, with his hands bound behind his back, Fabro knelt in front of Ghislain and his mercenary army. Though he bore a noble title, Fabro had no choice but to surrender. It was common in wartime for nobles to be taken as prisoners rather than executed. Just then, Belinda stepped on him, her boot pressing Fabro's head into the dirt. Belinda informed the others that Fabro was one of the vassals sent as an envoy to Dygald. Not only had he been selling information, but he had also been acting as Dygald's supply commander. Panic gripped Fabro as he pleaded with Ghislain, desperately begging for mercy. He surrendered without hesitation, throwing himself at Ghislain's mercy, hoping to survive. He had never imagined that the young Lord of Perdium, despite his reputation as the northern scoundrel, could lead such a force in battle. However, Ghislain remained calm and asked who had bribed Fabro, seizing what he believed to be a fleeting opportunity for survival. Fabro quickly revealed that he had been bribed by Count Desmond. He also explained that he had been threatened and had no choice but to follow through with his actions. Ghislain didn't linger on the information. His mind quickly shifted to the demons from his past life. With Fabro's admission, Ghislain knew for certain that Desmond's county had provided troops to Dygald to wage war against Perdium. Feeling ignored, Fabro became more desperate. He wailed loudly, insisting that, despite his actions, he had served Perdium for a long time. He argued that Count Dygald would surely pay a hefty ransom for his release, claiming that sparing him would be a profitable deal for Ghislain. Ghislain dismounted from his horse, his eyes unwavering, and told Fabro to raise his head. The words caused a brief flicker of relief to wash over the captured noble. Fabro thought he was being granted mercy. In his relief, Fabro began to make grand promises. He thanked Ghislain for sparing his life and vowed that with the life he had been given, he would serve Perdium with everything he had. But before Fabro could finish his words, Ghislain swung his sword, severing his neck in a single, smooth motion. The strike was immediate and without hesitation. Ghislain had no recollection of Fabro from his past life's timeline, suggesting that Fabro had never been significant. In that fleeting moment, Fabro was left unable to understand why he had been executed. Ghislain sighed, finding the situation absurd. He stated that he would never show noble courtesy on the battlefield and that he would never make a deal with someone like Fabro, whom he considered scum. With vengeance burning in his eyes, Ghislain vowed to hunt down every person who had turned their sword toward Perdium. He promised that death would come for them all. Once the deed was done, Ghislain led his mercenary army away from the remains of Dygald's supply camp. Despite the skirmish with 1,000 soldiers, Ghislain's forces had suffered little more than exhaustion, with no significant losses. Still concerned, Belinda watched Ghislain closely. This had been his first battle, and she couldn't help but wonder how he had killed so many soldiers with such apparent ease. He made it seem as natural as breathing, and yet the act of killing humans, as opposed to monsters, should have been far more difficult to bear. Kair approached Ghislain and asked what their next course of action would be. Ghislain, with his usual focus, replied that they would head straight back to the castle. He suspected that the enemy would likely attack immediately. With siege weapons at their disposal, Dygald's forces had been hurling massive stones at Perdium's castle walls. This was possible only because Count Desmond's county had provided them with the means to attack. As the catapults rained stones upon the walls, Dygald's infantry charged forward, attempting to overwhelm Perdium's smaller forces. Being a tactical strategist, Ghislain issued orders swiftly for Kair and Belinda to provide support on the left wall once they arrived, while he himself would move to the right wall. Right after, Ghislain called out to Gillian, putting him in charge of attacking Dygald's base. He explained that the assault was a surprise attack, and that he expected Gillian to face off against thousands of soldiers with a much smaller force. With that, Ghislain turned to Gillian and asked if he could handle the task. A faint smile crossed Gillian's lips as his eyes gleamed with excitement. He answered affirmatively, assuring his young lord that it would be no problem and that he would follow his orders without hesitation. In response, Ghislain smiled, the thought of his loyal mercenary pleasing him. After all, Gillian was like a sleeping lion, waiting to be awakened when the time was right. On the other hand, Kair scoffed, expressing his dissatisfaction that the old man always seemed to get the more exciting tasks. Meanwhile, Belinda raised a more pressing concern about who would defend the gate. Ghislain gave a definitive answer, ordering them to leave the gate alone. With the strategic mind of a seasoned commander, Ghislain did not explain further. With his experience as the mercenary king, who had once razed an entire kingdom to the ground, Will always had a plan. This left Ghislain's aides slightly confused. After all, to them, Ghislain was still a young lord who had gained fame as the northern scoundrel and was commanding an army for the first time. They had expected him to be uncertain, but his calm demeanor and strategic orders led them to wonder what he had in mind. Ghislain did not provide further explanation. Instead, he simply stated that this war would mark the beginning of a new chapter in Perdium's history. Meanwhile, Zwalter, a valiant high-level knight, stood firm against the overwhelming number of enemies. His voice rang out clearly, ordering his soldiers to prepare for the incoming assault. On the opposite side of the wall, Randolph, also a high-level knight, commanded the archers to fire at the advancing enemy. Though their numbers had been reduced by the rain of arrows, Dygald's soldiers were still too numerous to be easily stopped. With ladders in hand, they began scaling the walls, their numbers overwhelming Perdium's defenses. As the Dygald forces swarmed the wall, Zwalter immediately ordered his soldiers to engage in close-quarter combat. His brother Randolph closely followed behind. With the two of them leading the charge, they hoped to hold off the advancing enemy. Seeing the wall begin to crumble and his forces overwhelm it, the commander of Dygald's forces laughed manically. His joy was palpable as he thought victory was finally within his reach. He clapped his hands in delight, exclaiming how exhilarating it was. Even without dispatching their strongest knight, he was sure the battle was won. However, Victor remained focused, keeping his eyes on the battlefield. As Dygald continued issuing orders for the catapults to prepare for a second volley, Victor thought inwardly that it was finally time for the Northern Wolf to meet his end. He had hoped to face Zwalter, but now, seeing the way things were unfolding, he believed he wouldn't even need to lift a finger. Inside the walls, Zwalter, the Northern Wolf, faced a relentless swarm of mercenaries disguised as Dygald soldiers. With practiced ease, he blocked an incoming attack, sidestepping and swinging his sword to strike at the side of one of the mercenaries. But the enemy continued to pour in, and despite his strength and skill, Zwalter, alongside Randolph, found themselves surrounded. Maintaining his composure, Randolph expressed his frustration. The walls were one thing, but at this rate, the gate would fall soon. Thus, he asked what the Lord's orders were. Deciding to trust in Ghislain's earlier instructions, Zwalter ordered the soldiers to focus solely on holding the walls and to leave the gate alone. After giving the order, Zwalter turned to Scoven, asking about reinforcements. Scoven reported that the messengers sent to the surrounding territories had all returned with refusal of support. The Zimbar and Rayfold territories both claimed internal issues and could not provide assistance. Furthermore, every messenger sent to Count Loges had lost contact, and no word had come back. For various reasons, not a single estate had offered any support. Frustrated, Randolph could only curse under his breath, wondering aloud how none of the territories had sent help. He could barely contain his anger at their unwillingness to support Perdium, calling them ungrateful bastards. Within the ranks of Dygald's forces, bad news also reached the command post, delivered by a soldier. Both Dygald and Victor were visibly surprised when a soldier reported the possibility that their supply unit had been ambushed. The soldier explained that the soldiers they had sent to request supplies still hadn't returned, which suggested something had gone wrong with the supply unit. However, Dygald refused to accept such a possibility. He could not fathom that their supply unit, consisting of 1,000 soldiers, could have been wiped out while Perdium's entire force was holed up in their castle. On the other hand, Victor considered the report carefully. He suspected the possibility might be true. Though the supply unit's location was supposed to be covert, Victor could already see smoke billowing up from the area. Inwardly, Victor thought to himself that there was still someone in Perdium bold enough to think strategically. It was common knowledge that the smaller an army's strength, the harder it was to risk such a bold strategy. His eyes gleamed with excitement as he realized how interesting the war was becoming. At this point, Dygald turned to Victor and asked what they should do. Without supplies, their siege would be cut short, especially considering that Perdium's entire army was holding up within their castle. Victor raised his hand, silencing Dygald's concerns. If they couldn't thin out Perdium's supplies, they would simply break through Perdium's walls with their sheer numbers. He was confident they did not need supplies, stating with certainty that they would take Perdium's castle by the end of the day. Dygald stammered in disbelief. If they charged relentlessly, they would undoubtedly overwhelm Perdium's forces, but the losses they would suffer would be catastrophic. At that moment, Victor considered killing Dygald right there and then. After all, Dygald was merely Desmond's pawn, while Victor, the real commander, striving to be known as the Northern finest sword. But for now, Victor chose to spare him, deciding to deal with him later when Perdium had fallen. Victor continued his assessment of the battle. The assault on the left and right walls had begun long ago, yet they hadn't broken through. He thought of how Perdium's elite forces, including the Northern Wolf, were likely holding the line. But as he surveyed the situation, he noticed that the front gate was left undefended. It seemed clear to him that the gate lacked any defenders. With that realization, he raised his sword and ordered the rest of his army to charge forward. His voice was filled with conviction as he proclaimed that, by the end of the day, they would smash through the gate. Behind him, Desmond's forces, disguised as Dygald soldiers, advanced with their siege towers. Their sheer number dwarfed anything that Perdium could muster.